reports and first-hand experiences. Some of them were resolved, others weren't. This is what was found and what wasn't. If you're new here, subscribe right now and ring that notification bell. New episodes drop in every 2 days, and you don't want to miss a single one. Story 1. My name is Darnell. I'm 43 years old and I've been a long-haul trucker for going on 20 years now. I'm not a nervous man by any measure of the word. I have driven through whiteout blizzards in Montana and black ice on the passes in the Cascades. I have pulled into rest stops at 3 in the morning in the Nevada desert, where the only other vehicle was a windowless van with no plates, and I didn't think twice about it. I have logged more hours alone in the dark than most people do in a lifetime, and I have done it without developing the habit of jumping at shadows. I'm telling you all of this because I want you to understand exactly who I am before I tell you what I saw in the mountains of western North Carolina. I want you to understand that I am not the type of man who scares easy, and what I am about to describe scared me badly. It was the October of 2017. I had been running hard for 6 weeks straight, short on sleep and long on interstate, eating mostly out of gas station coolers and fast food windows. And my wife Sandra told me at dinner one night that I was going to give myself a stroke if I didn't do something about it. She said it the way Sandra says things she has decided about, which is calmly and without room for argument. She was right. Sandra is almost always right. So I took a week off and decided to do something I hadn't done since I was maybe 19 or 20 years old. I was going to go camping alone. Nothing fancy about the plan. I loaded up the pickup with a tent and sleeping bag and my old Coleman camp stove, a cooler full of food, a case of beer, and a couple of paperback novels I'd been meaning to get to for about a year. A buddy of mine named Lionel had told me about a stretch of the Pisgah National Forest in the mountains up from Asheville where he'd spent some time. Said it was so quiet and remote that you could go 4 or 5 days without seeing another soul if you picked the right access road and walked in far enough. Lionel's not a man who exaggerates, so I took his word for it. He was right. I drove the gravel access road in on a Wednesday afternoon, parked at a small pull-off near a stream crossing, and set up camp about 100 yards from the water in a flat area under a canopy of big oaks and rhododendron that was thicker than anything I'd camped in before. The air was cold and clean and had that smell of wet earth and distant wood smoke that city people don't encounter enough. By the time I had the tent staked down and the fire going, I felt better than I had in months. I sat by that fire with a beer sweating in my hand, and I genuinely could not remember the last time I felt my shoulders actually drop. The first 3 days were about as perfect as 3 days get. I hiked during the mornings, sometimes with no particular destination, sometimes following the stream up into the higher terrain where the water came fast and cold, over rounded boulders. I cooked simple food in the evenings. I read the paperbacks. I slept. I did not look at my phone. On the second morning, I startled a grouse off a log at about 10 feet and nearly jumped out of my boots, which made me feel foolish in the good way that solitude in the woods allows you to feel foolish without embarrassment. I saw deer twice, heard a fox scream one night, and watched a pair of ravens work the ridgeline above me for most of one afternoon. Normal forest things. Good things. The kind of things that make you remember why you wanted to come out here in the first place. The fourth day is when things started to feel off, and I want to be precise about the word fee, because that is genuinely how it started. There was no specific event, no sound, no sight. Just a shift in the quality of the afternoon that I registered somewhere below the level of conscious thought. A feeling like a pressure change before a storm, except the sky was clear and the barometer wasn't dropping. I'd been back at camp for a couple of hours, had my chili on the stove, had changed out of my wet boots, and was sitting in my camp chair when I noticed I was being watched. Now I know exactly how that sounds. Every story like this starts with that feeling. I know. But let me try to describe it as specifically as I can, because there was nothing vague about it. It was directional. It was coming from the tree line to the north of my camp, across a stretch of open ground maybe 50 or 60 yards wide. I turned and looked at that tree line, and at first I saw exactly what you'd expect to see. Trees, shadows between the trunks, the late afternoon light going orange and low through the upper branches. But I kept looking the way you keep looking when something has told you to keep looking without knowing what it's told you, and after maybe a minute I saw it. There was a shape at the edge of the trees, standing between two large oaks, partially obscured by the shadow, but present enough to resolve as a shape once I'd oriented to it. It was tall, taller than a person, taller than I would have thought possible given the geometry of the trees around it. 7 feet, maybe slightly more, standing still. Not the swaying stillness of a bear, up on its hind legs thinking about whether it needs to be concerned. A different kind of still. The stillness of something that has been there for a while and is comfortable being there. The proportions were wrong. I've been turning this over for years now, and that is the word I keep arriving at. Wrong. The limbs were too long relative to the body, held at a slight angle away from the torso. The way a person holds their arms when something is wrong with their hands. The head looked small for the body, or else the shoulders were very wide. And I couldn't determine at that distance, and in that light, which was true. The surface of it was dark, not like dark clothing, uniformly dark, as if it was absorbing the evening light rather than catching it. I sat in my camp chair for what felt like a long time but was probably 30 seconds, staring at it and not moving. Then my chili started bubbling over onto the stove grate, and I looked down for just a fraction of a second to pull the pot off the heat. When I looked back up at the tree line, it was gone. Not there. Just trees and shadow and the last warm light of that October evening. I want to tell you I shrugged and ate my dinner and slept perfectly and woke up refreshed. That's not what happened. I didn't sleep. I lay in my tent that whole long night, with my hunting knife in my right hand and my back against the far side of the sleeping bag, listening to the forest, the way you listen when you've been genuinely frightened. Nothing approached camp. Nothing made any sound that was out of place. But around 3 a.m, maybe 3:15, I heard something that I have never been able to explain and have spent considerable mental energy trying to. Breathing. Coming from somewhere in the trees off to the north of my tent. Deep, slow, deliberate breathing. Not the huffing of an excited animal or the rapid breath of something in motion. Something breathing slowly and very deeply in the dark. The way something breathes when it is entirely at rest and entirely comfortable. It lasted maybe 45 seconds, and then it stopped, the way a recording stops when someone hits the button. Not fading, not retreating, just gone. As if whatever had been making it had simply decided to stop. I was packed and driving the gravel road back out before sunrise. I've been back to the Pisgah twice since then for day hikes in groups on maintained trails in the middle of the day. I don't stay after dark. My wife still asks me occasionally why camping doesn't interest me anymore, and I tell her I just got it out of my system. That's the version she gets. This is the real one. Story 2, the trail that wasn't on any map. This is Greta. I'm a high school biology teacher from just outside Chattanooga, and I have been hiking in the Appalachian region since I was about 14 years old, when my father started taking me out on weekends. I know these mountains. That's not arrogance talking, that's just the straightforward truth. I know how to read a topographic map and how to navigate by compass in terrain where the trails have degraded or disappeared. I know what the animals sound like, and more importantly, what they don't sound like. I know how weather moves through these ridges and how quickly conditions can change at elevation in the shoulder seasons. I'm not a person who gets lost out there, and I'm not a person who lets her imagination wander when she's alone in the backcountry. I was a lab scientist before I retrained as a teacher, and I still approach everything, including frightening personal experience, with the same methodology. Observe precisely, record carefully, resist premature conclusions. So when I tell you about what happened on a solo section hike in the Nantahala National Forest the summer before last, I need you to hear that I have already done the work of exhausting every rational explanation I can bring to it. I've run the facts through every framework I have. I've talked to other experienced hikers about the specifics. I've looked into the land history of the area. None of it has produced an explanation that holds together under scrutiny, and I'm a person who requires explanations to hold together. I was 4 days into a 4-day solo trip on a route I'd done once before, about 6 years prior. I knew the general terrain well enough to be comfortable with the route, and I was carrying a full navigation kit in addition to my phone. Second day out, mid-morning, clear weather, good trail conditions, temperature in the low 70s with a breeze. I was moving well and feeling good about the day. I came around a long bend through a thick rhododendron thicket, the kind that forms a tunnel over the trail that's dark even in midday. And when I came out the other side, I was at a trail junction I did not recognize. There was a post in the ground, old wood with old paint, with a blaze on it that was not standard. Not the white rectangle of the AT, not the colored blazes of the National Forest System. A different shape entirely, angular and deliberate, carved into the wood rather than painted on. The trail branching off from the posts ran downhill to the northwest, into a hollow I couldn't see the bottom of. I pulled out my map, nothing. There was no trail at that location, not even an unofficial use trail. I pulled out my GPS unit and double-checked my position. The coordinates placed me exactly where I expected to be on my planned route. And yet there was this junction in this trail, clearly used in recently, the dirt packed down by regular foot traffic, and the brush on either side worn back in a way that happens over years of passage. I stood there for a while, being precise about what I was seeing. Old trails get decommissioned from official maps all the time. Landowners create their own access routes. Former fire roads get reclaimed by vegetation, but still retain their packed soil. All of this is true, and I ran through all of it standing at that junction. But there were two things I could not explain away. First, the blaze itself, which was not any trail marking system I'd encountered in 20-odd years of hiking in this region. And second, the quality of the light down in that hollow, which was wrong in a way I found difficult to quantify, even with my science brain. It was cooler in temperature and flatter in character than the light in the surrounding forest, as if something about the air in that hollow was different. And there was a smell coming from below, animal and old, the kind of smell that registers below language and produces a direct physical response. I took my time at that junction. I photographed the blaze and the junction from multiple angles. I noted the GPS coordinates. I thought about it rationally. And then I walked past the junction and continued on my planned route. The rational part of my brain said there was nothing to fear from an unmapped trail. The other part said no with a force that I've only encountered a few times in my life, and which I have learned to take seriously even when I can't justify it logically. That night I camped on a ridge about 4 miles further along and slept with my usual camp hygiene. Food hung properly on a bear hang, sight clean, tent zipped. I woke up in the deep middle of the night for no reason I could identify, and lay still the way I've learned to, taking stock before moving. The night was quiet, the forest ambient was normal, and I was just starting to drift back off when the footsteps began. Not the irregular crunch and snap of an animal moving through underbrush. Footsteps. Two-legged, deliberate, unhurried, making a wide, slow circle around my campsite. The spacing between footfalls was greater than a normal human stride by a significant margin, like something with legs built for long ground coverage, but it was moving slowly and carefully. It circled my camp twice. I counted both rotations. Then it stopped somewhere behind my tent, northwest by my estimate of maybe 18 to 20 feet from where I lay. And then it made a sound. Not a vocalization in any sense I knew how to classify. It had the structure of language in the same way that a mockingbird has the structure of other birds' songs without actually being those songs. Clicking stops and a sustained low resonance beneath them that I felt in my chest more than I heard with my ears. 10 seconds, maybe 12, and then nothing. No departure, no retreat. Just an end, the same abrupt nothing as before. In the morning, I checked the ground around my tent. The soil was soft from rain 2 days prior, and I had left clear boot prints in my own approach to the site. The ground in a perimeter around my camp showed nothing. No indentations, no displaced leaf litter, no evidence of any weight having moved around out there. I have no explanation for this. You cannot make footsteps on soft ground without leaving evidence. Whatever I heard, whatever circled my camp twice and stood behind me in the dark, did not leave tracks. When I got home, I contacted the National Forest Service with the GPS coordinates of the junction and a copy of the photos I'd taken of the blaze. 3 weeks later, I got a response telling me they had no record of any trail at those coordinates, and that they had been unable to locate the junction I'd described when a field crew went to check. I've been back to those coordinates once since on a day hike and found nothing, no post, no blaze, no junction. Clean forest. I don't know what was down in that hollow. I don't know what was in the trees around my tent that night. I know that both things felt connected in a way I couldn't have articulated then and still can't now. What I can tell you with the confidence of a trained observer is that the conventional explanations don't hold. And in my experience, when the conventional explanations don't hold, the correct response is not to reach for a supernatural one. The correct response is to keep looking. I'm still looking. If this story is getting to you, drop a comment below telling me the exact detail that unsettled you most. I read every single comment and replied to as many as I can. Your engagement is what keeps this community going. Story 3. I go by Colt. I'm retired military, 20 years in, with 6 combat deployments across 2 theaters. I now run a landscaping business out of the Roanoke area in Virginia. I bring up my service not to establish some kind of authority, but because of what I'm about to say next, and I need you to understand the weight of it. I have never in my life felt the quality of fear I felt on that ridge in Shenandoah. Not in Fallujah in 2004. Not in the Korengal Valley in 2009. Not once in 20 years of being in environments that were actively trying to kill me. Whatever I encountered in those mountains before dawn on that Sunday morning reached into something older and deeper than any training can prepare you for. It was a September trip 3 years back. Just me and my buddy Terrence, who I've known since we went through basic together back in the 90s. We'd done Shenandoah together twice before, nothing too demanding. Backcountry permits on a remote section of the park that stays quiet because it requires a longer approach than most weekend visitors want to deal with. We both like it for that reason. We'd spent the better part of a year trying to get our schedules to line up for this particular trip, and we were both looking forward to it. Friday night was good. We set up camp in the last of the evening light, cooked, had a little of the good whiskey Terrence had packed in, talked about his divorce, which had just finalized, talked about my daughter's college plans, the usual stuff that accumulates between 2 people who don't see each other enough. Turned in around 10:30. Saturday was a long day, 11 miles of trail, some good elevation change, a lunch break on an exposed rock with a view east that made the whole drive up worth it. We ate well that evening and turned in early because we planned to be off the ridge before the day got hot. What I'm about to describe happened at approximately 5:20 Sunday morning. It was still full dark and only the thinnest gray suggesting the east. Terrence grabbed my shoulder, and his grip was the kind of grip that communicates information without words. I was awake and alert in about 2 seconds. He was sitting upright in his sleeping bag, facing the tent door, and his hand was shaking. Terrence does not shake. I have seen this man under conditions that would take most people apart, and he has never shaken. His hand was shaking on my shoulder. He put his mouth next to my ear and said, barely above a breath, that someone had been walking around our camp for the past 10 minutes. He'd been lying awake tracking it. Wide circle, deliberate pace, unhurried, like whatever was out there had all the time in the world. I had my sidearm. I carry legally and I'd brought it on the trip. I unzipped the tent and stepped out with it in my right hand and my headlamp in my left. Terrence came up behind me. We moved clear of the tent and I swept the area. It was standing at the edge of the tree line, maybe 30 feet out, in the beam of my headlamp. Just standing there, not moving, not reacting to the light the way an animal would. Standing and looking at us. And this is the part I've struggled with every single time I've tried to tell this story. Because no matter how precisely I try to describe it, the words come out sounding like I was dreaming or hallucinating, or that I let fear distort my perception. I was not dreaming. I have been trained to perceive accurately under stress, and I was perceiving accurately. What I saw was a figure with the face of Terrence. Not similar to his face, not a resemblance. Not the kind of likeness that fear and low light and an overactive mind can produce when you're staring at a stranger in the dark. The face on that figure was the specific face of the specific man standing 2 feet to my right. The same jawline, the same broad flat nose, the same close beard he'd been keeping since his early 30s. I knew it was not Terrence because Terrence was breathing hard right next to me. But the face in my headlamp beam was his face. Terrence made a sound. I don't know how else to put it. It was short and involuntary. The kind of sound that comes out of the involuntary nervous system. The part below decision. And the figure's head moved. That's the other thing. It moved in a way that necks are not built for. Too far, too fluid, past the natural range. Like it was mounted on something other than vertebrae. And then it stepped backward into the trees, and it was gone. We left camp at that moment. We didn't discuss it. We threw the loose gear into our packs, and we were moving within 4 minutes of the thing stepping back into the trees. We didn't speak for the first mile of trail. When we reached the parking lot, Terrence sat on the tailgate of his truck for a while, and I stood and watched the tree line, and neither of us said anything about the face. We've talked about that morning exactly twice in the 3 years since. Both times were brief, and both times ended the same way, with one of us saying we should probably just leave it alone, and the other agreeing. What I think about alone in the dark, what I can't stop thinking about, is the thing that the face implies. Whatever that was, it had spent enough time watching us to learn what Terrence looked like. Watching closely enough to get the details right. The beard, the jaw, the specific set of his eyes. It had been watching us long enough to build a copy of his face. And if it was out there watching us that night and the night before, then what else had it seen? What else did it know about us? What was it going to do with that? Story 4. My name is Priya. I'm a pediatric nurse based in Baltimore, and I've been doing weekend trail running in the mountain region since about 2015, when a colleague talked me into my first trail race, and I was immediately hooked. There's nothing else like it as far as I'm concerned. The degree of focus required when you're running technical terrain, roots and rocks, and cambered trail with variable footing doesn't leave room in your head for anything else. Every mental background process that normally runs in parallel just shuts down for the duration. It became the thing that kept me sane through difficult shifts and a difficult 1.5 years after my mother died. I run in a lot of different places, but the Blue Ridge Parkway area is where I go most often because of the drive time from where I live. I want to say something up front before I get into what I found. I'm a nurse by training and by disposition. I have worked pediatric oncology, which means I have sat across from some of the worst things that can happen to human beings, and I have stayed functional and professional throughout. I don't flinch easy, and I don't exaggerate the details of things I've seen. When I tell you that what I found on a solo trail run last May shook me badly enough that I sat in my car in the parking lot for 40 minutes before I felt steady enough to drive home, I am not using hyperbole. I am giving you the plain fact of what happened in my body. It was a Sunday in the second week of May, which in the Blue Ridge means cool air and new green and wildflowers, just opening in the understory, perfect running conditions. I was on a trail I'd run probably 35 times, out and back with a small loop at the far end, a route I knew so well I could have navigated it blindfolded. About 4.5 miles in, I came off the main trail at a spot I know, where a faint use trail drops down a short slope to a flat rock, with a view down a narrow valley. I'd been stopping there to drink water and catch the view for years. I knew that rock and that clearing the way. You know, a favorite bench in a park you've been visiting since childhood. From the moment I stepped off the main trail, I knew something was different. The birds, which had been loud and busy all morning, went silent in a way I've come to recognize as significant after years of spending time in these woods. Not gradually quiet the way they go when you approach, a switch off, abrupt and total, like a recording stopping. I kept moving down the slope, slower than usual, not sure what I was bracing for. The clearing around the flat rock had been arranged. That's the only word for it. In a circle approximately 15 feet in diameter, laid carefully on the ground, were bones. A large number of bones, mixed sizes, clearly from multiple animals, and old by their appearance, bleached and dry, but I knew with certainty they had not been there 6 weeks earlier when I'd stood in that exact spot. The circle was geometrically precise in a way that was impossible to attribute to accident or natural deposition. Someone with patience and intention had placed each element. At the center of the circle, 3 larger bones, which I estimated were deer femurs, had been arranged in a tight triangle oriented uphill. On the flat rock itself, there was something else. A piece of dark bark, large and thick, placed deliberately in the center of the rock's surface. On the bark, and a substance that I believed, based on color and texture, to be blood, were symbols. Not letters in any Latin or Cyrillic or other alphabet I recognized. Angular shapes repeating in a pattern across the whole surface of the bark, dense and careful, like someone had taken considerable time with it. I stood at the edge of the circle outside it, and I looked at all of this for perhaps 60 seconds. My brain was doing the thing it does in clinical situations, which is observe and catalog without emoting. I noted the dimensions of the circle and the placement of the central bones and the characteristics of the symbols on the bark. And then I turned and I ran back up the slope to the main trail. And I did not run at my normal pace. I ran the way you run when you have assessed a situation and found it dangerous. When I was maybe 100 yards back up and moving on the main trail, I heard something behind and to my left, in the trees off the downhill side of the trail. A sound that I've spent a long time since trying to describe, and the best I've gotten is this. It sounded like antlers, like 2 sets of large antlers being drawn together slowly and rhythmically, that dry, woody clatter, but regular and timed, almost like a deliberate percussion, moving through the trees parallel to my direction of travel, keeping pace with me for about 200 yards. Then it stopped. I reported what I'd found to the Forest Service when I got to my car. 3 days later, a ranger called me back and said they had sent someone to check the location based on my GPS coordinates. He told me, sounding slightly uncomfortable about it, that the crew had not found anything at that location. Nothing. Clean ground. I've turned that over many times. Either the ranger was not telling me the truth for some reason, which is possible, or whoever or whatever placed those objects came back for them before the crew got there, which would require knowing that someone was coming, which is unsettling in a different way. Or the crew went to the wrong location, which seems unlikely given that I provided specific GPS coordinates. None of these options makes me feel better, and none of them explains what I found in that clearing or what paced me through the trees on the way out. I'm still running, but I don't go back to that particular valley anymore, and I don't stop on that flat rock. Have you ever found something out in the wilderness that had absolutely no business being there? Tell me in the comments. Some of the best stories I've ever received started as a comment on one of these videos. Story 5, I'm Fletcher. I'm 31, I work in IT support, I play bass in a band that gigs about once a month when we're lucky, and I want to be upfront about the fact that the outdoors is fundamentally not my world. I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio. I live in Pittsburgh now. My relationship with nature prior to this particular weekend was approximately the relationship I have with accounting. I understand it exists, and I have mild respect for it, and I don't engage with it if I can avoid it. The camping trip in question was my first, and so far, only solo overnight, and it happened because my therapist suggested it. She said something about solitude and sitting with yourself and disconnecting from technology and how it might be beneficial for the particular flavor of anxiety I carry. I trust her judgment. She's never steered me wrong. She probably could not have predicted what would happen in an Ohio State Park on that September Friday night, and I'm not blaming her. I'm just noting that when I tell you what I heard and saw, you should understand that the person telling it is someone who went in there with no camping mythology, no ghost stories, no preconceptions about what wild places are supposed to feel like in the dark. What I experienced didn't come from my imagination filling in blanks with horror movie residue. I went in there basically blank and came out with something I have no category for. I picked the Ohio Pile because it's in the Laurel Highlands of Pennsylvania, and it's drivable from Pittsburgh, and because the park has developed backcountry sites with fire rings that felt manageable for a first solo trip. I'd done my research, I watched videos, I had a reasonable gear list, and I'd done a test setup of the tent in my apartment living room. I was nervous in a way that felt appropriate for someone doing something new. The kind of nervous that's actually excitement wearing a raincoat. The site was beautiful. A few miles in along a creek, elevated bank above the water, good views up and downstream, a fire ring with previous ash in it from whoever had been there last. I got set up without any problems, made my dinner, and sat watching the water go dark as the light failed. The creek was loud, a good constant noise, and I found myself relaxing into it faster than I expected. I fell asleep earlier than usual, before 10, which never happens to me. I woke up at some point after 2 in the morning, no apparent reason. I lay still for a while, the way I'd been reading that experienced campers do before moving, just listening. The creek, the occasional sound of something small in the underbrush. Normal, all of it. I drifted towards sleep again and then heard the voice. It was coming from downstream. Not close, I thought at first. Maybe a quarter mile. A man's voice, old with that thin quality that very elderly voices have. The kind where the vocal cords aren't sealing tight and the tone is slightly breathy. He was saying something continuous, not pausing the way people pause in conversation. A sustained monologue in a voice too faint and too distant for me to catch words. I told myself, other camper. There were other sites on this section of creek. There was no reason someone couldn't be awake at 2 in the morning, talking in their sleep, or in some kind of distress. I was almost back under when the voice came again, closer this time by a significant margin, maybe 100 yards. Still coming from downstream, still moving upstream toward me. And now I could hear that it was not English, not any language I recognized. It had a cadence and a structure that was language-shaped, stops and continuations, rising and falling inflections. But the sounds that composed it were not sounds I could match to anything I'd ever heard spoken. I unzipped the tent flap about 3 inches and looked out. The moon was up and bright, and the creek bank and the water were both fully visible. And there, on a large, flat boulder about 80 yards downstream, sitting cross-legged and facing the water, was an old man. Very thin white hair, loose and long, wearing what looked from that distance like layered clothing of different kinds. He was facing the water, and he was talking to it, or at it, both hands moving in slow gestures like a conductor working through something unhurried and complex. I watched him for probably 2 full minutes. The voice carried on the surface of the water in a way I wouldn't have expected, clear and present even at that distance. And then, without any change in the rhythm or the volume or the cadence of what he was saying, he turned his head and looked directly at me. Not toward me, at me. Specific, precise eye contact across 80 yards of moonlit creek bank, through a 3-inch gap in my tent door that was nearly invisible in the shadow of the overhang. He found me as if he'd known exactly where I was. He stopped speaking. He looked at me. And then he stood up from the rock in a way that old men do not stand up. He unfolded from cross-legged to standing in one continuous motion with no apparent use of his hands and No moment of mechanical awkwardness. Just upright, as if the joints involved were different from standard human joints. And he began walking toward me along the bank. I pulled back inside, zipped the tent, got my back against the far side of the shelter, and held very still. 30 seconds later, I heard his footsteps on the bank outside, close, maybe 8 feet from the tent wall. He was moving upstream, past my sight, not slowing, not stopping. The footsteps had a quality I've thought about many times since. They were regular and unhurried, the pace of someone going somewhere they know well and have been going for a long time. They faded upstream, and I did not hear them stop. When first light made the inside of the tent bright enough to see the fabric texture, I packed everything and hiked out. I didn't run, I just moved with purpose. When I got home, I sat on my kitchen floor for a while before I did anything else. I told my therapist about it the following week. She was thoughtful about it, which I appreciated. She didn't dismiss it. She also didn't have an explanation. Neither did I then. Neither do I now. Story 6. Weston here, 46 years old, been bow hunting since I was 16 when my grandfather first took me into the hardwoods behind his property in eastern Kentucky and showed me how to be still. That's the exact phrase he used. Not hunting, being still. He said the forest will communicate everything you need if you can get quiet enough to listen. He was right about that, and it shaped the way I've moved through wild country ever since. I've spent more combined hours in tree stands and ground blinds than I have at most other single activities in my life. I know deer the way a mechanic knows engines. I know their gait, their smell, the difference between the way a doe walks and a buck walks, the sound of hooves in wet leaves versus dry leaves. Deer recognition is not something I've had to think consciously about in a long time. It's automatic and it's reliable. So when I tell you that what I saw in the mountains of eastern Tennessee during bow season 3 falls ago was not a deer, I need you to hold on to the full weight of that statement. This is not someone unfamiliar with deer shapes seeing something ambiguous in low light and getting confused. This is someone for whom deer recognition is a professional skill, telling you that what moved through those trees was not a deer. I had a spot I'd been hunting for years on a piece of family land in Polk County that backed up against the Cherokee National Forest. Old-growth hardwood ridges with creek bottoms between them. The kind of country that holds good deer numbers because the combination of cover and browse and water is ideal. I'd taken some of my best animals from a particular white oak ridge where the mass crop was always reliable. That October morning, I was in a hang-on stand 18 feet up the white oak itself, in position before first light. Temperature in the high 30s and falling. The morning moved normally. Birds at first light, then squirrels, then a doe at about 6:30, working her way through the creek bottom below me at 60 yards. She fed for a while, and moved on. I settled in. The woods stayed active in the way they do on a good cold morning in rut buildup. A small buck passed through at 7:15, nothing I was interested in. And then around 8, the forest went quiet. This is the part of any hunting story where I lose non-hunters, because this quiet is real and it's distinct, and every experienced hunter knows it immediately. It's not the quiet of there being no animals. It's the quiet of animals that are there, deciding not to make noise. It's a held breath. It's what happens when something is moving through an area that the animals have collectively decided to pay close attention to. I started glassing the timber downhill from my stand, moving my binoculars slowly through the visual field the way you do. And about 120 yards out, at the margin of fog in the creek bottom, something moved. My first take was deer. The movement had the right rhythm, the hip-heavy bob of a deer walking. The coloration was in the right range. I raised the binoculars and found the shape and tracked it. The legs were wrong. That was the first thing. Too long for the body, jointed at angles that deer joints don't achieve, and moving in a gait that was close to a deer's but imprecise in a way I couldn't immediately name. Like something that had studied the movement pattern and reproduced it with high but not perfect accuracy. The head was down, which deer do when feeding, but this thing wasn't stopping to browse. It was moving at a steady pace, head held low, and I could see that the neck was too long and too flexible for what it was attached to. Then it stopped in a gap in the fog and raised its head, and I looked at it through my binoculars at roughly 120 yards, and I saw what was wrong. The face was wrong. I'm going to struggle here the same way I struggle every time I try to describe this to someone, because there is no good language for what I saw. The face had the quality of something that had been stripped back to structure. The skin was either absent or drawn so tight across the underlying architecture that it was functionally invisible. The eye placement was forward-facing. Binocular vision, predator configuration. Not the lateral placement of a prey animal's eyes, which deer have. And the neck was wrong, too long and too articulated. It turned its head and found my tree stand. And that regard hit me the way nothing has ever hit me in the woods. Every hair on every part of my body went up simultaneously. It looked at me for what I believe was between 20 and 30 seconds, though time does strange things in moments like that. Then it went down into the fog, not running, not moving away quickly. It simply lowered itself back to ground level, the way it had come up, and was absorbed into the fog and gone. I climbed down from that stand and walked back to my truck without going for my pack, which I'd left at the base of the tree. I went back for it the next morning in full daylight with my cousin walking with me, and I didn't tell him why I wanted company. I've not been back to that ridge since. Told my cousin the deer activity wasn't there anymore. He believed me. I know of 2 other hunters in that county who have described something similar in adjacent hollows over the past decade. We don't have a meeting about it or anything. We just know not to mention certain draws and certain creek bottoms. And none of us hunt after dark down there anymore. That's not a formal agreement. It's just something we all independently arrived at. This channel just launched its membership program, and I want you to know that every single member genuinely helps keep this going. Click the join button right below the video for early access to every new episode, bonus content, and extended cuts. It means more than I can say. Story 7. My name is Joel, and I want to start with the verified facts before I get into anything else, because the verified facts are strange enough on their own, and I want you to have them as a foundation before I describe the rest. I'm a social worker by training and by profession, which means I am extremely precise about distinguishing between what someone reports and what can be objectively confirmed. Here is what can be objectively confirmed about what happened to me in the Smoky Mountains. I left the trailhead on a Thursday morning. My sister expected me back the following Sunday afternoon, per the itinerary I had given her. I returned to my car on a Wednesday. I have cell phone location data, camera timestamps, and the testimony of my sister and the park volunteer who was at the trailhead when I came out, all of which confirmed that I was in the backcountry for 6 days rather than 4. I remember 3 of those days. I do not remember the other 3. The 3 I do not remember were not the result of any medical condition that any doctor I have subsequently seen has been able to identify. I'll describe what I do remember before I get to what I don't. Thursday was clear and uneventful. I hiked in about 9 miles to my planned first campsite, set up camp, cooked dinner, wrote in my journal, slept well. Friday morning, I remember waking up and making coffee and breaking down camp. I remember shouldering my pack. And then there is nothing. Not blurry, not fragmentary. Nothing. The next clear memory I have is sitting at a campsite with my tent already set up around me, a feeling of profound confusion. A thirst unlike anything I've experienced before or since, and the specific cognitive sensation of not being able to locate myself in time, which is deeply unpleasant in a way I find difficult to describe. My phone told me it was Monday. My body felt like I had been asleep for a very long time and had not been resting. The campsite I was at was not on my planned route. I was miles off course in a section of the park I didn't recognize from my planning maps. And there was no rational explanation for how I had gotten there or who had set up my tent. The tent was correctly staked and rain fly properly attached, better than I usually do, which is strange. What was in my camera is what I need to describe next. I take a lot of photos when I hike. It's a habit. Throughout Thursday, I had taken 43 photos. Normal hiking photos, views, a salamander I'd found under a log, the tent at the campsite, and evening light. After that batch, there are 41 more photos, time-stamped across what the camera's clock recorded as Friday night, Saturday night, and Sunday night. I did not take these photos, or I have no memory of taking them. Each one is a photo of forest at night, shot from approximately the same position, with my headlamp visible in the lower portion of the frame, illuminating the same stretch of trees in front of me. 41 exposures of the same dark trees. The timestamps are irregular, scattered across the hours between midnight and 4 in the morning for 3 consecutive nights. In the 23rd photo, there is something at the edge of the frame. At the very furthest reach of the headlamp's beam, in the shadow at the base of a large tree, there is a shape. It is tall, pale in a way that catches the low light differently than the tree trunks around it, and the image quality at that distance and exposure is not sufficient to define it clearly. But it is there. In the 24th photo, it is gone. In photos 25 through 37, it does not appear. In the 38th photo, it is back, closer by a considerable margin. In the 39th photo, it fills approximately 1/4 of the right side of the frame. I have looked at that 39th photo more times than I can count, and I will not attempt to describe the specifics of what's in it beyond what I've already said, because what I can see in that image, if it is what it appears to be, implies things about those 3 nights that I am not ready to face directly. The last 2 images in the sequence are both entirely white, overexposed, as if the flash fired at contact distance, or as if something pressed itself against the front of the lens. I've been evaluated neurologically and psychologically by multiple practitioners since this happened. No one has found evidence of the medical events that would explain a 3-day memory gap. The social worker in me wants to find a clinical explanation and hold on to it because clinical explanations are something I know how to work with. But the 41 photos exist. The timestamps exist. The location data exists. Whatever happened in those mountains over those 3 nights is documented in ways that don't bend to clinical categories, and I have stopped trying to make it do so. Story 8. This is Ambrose, 61 years old, retired postal worker from Asheville, North Carolina, and I've been walking these mountains my whole life. Grew up in them, raised 3 kids nearby. And when I retired a few years back, I started doing the longer hikes I'd been putting off for 30 years. I go mostly with my dog Rogue, a 7-year-old red-boned coonhound who is, without exaggeration, the best judge of character and situation I've ever known in any species. A dog like that, a working hound bred for decades for its courage and its nose and its steadiness, is not a dog you dismiss when it reacts to something. When Rogue is concerned, I am concerned. When Rogue is calm, I can be calm. That has been the working arrangement between us for 7 years, and it has never failed. Rogue has been close to bears on 2 occasions during our hikes together. Both times she barked once, assessed the situation with her nose, and waited for my command. She didn't shake. She didn't whimper. She is a serious and composed animal, and I trust her assessment of things in the woods more than I trust my own. August before last. I was doing an overnight in a section of the Roan Highlands, up on the state line between Tennessee and North Carolina. High balds with long grass and views in every direction, and a sky that at night, up at that elevation, is unlike anything you'll find closer to sea level. I'd done this route before, and I knew the terrain. We made camp in the last of the evening light on a flat section just below the crest of the main bald, out of the wind, but with a clear line of sight across the open grass above us. Made dinner, watched the stars come in, which at that altitude on a clear August night is genuinely one of the better things a person can do. Rogue curled against my legs as the temperature dropped and we turned in around 10. I woke up, Rogue was already standing, her full length rigid, in the middle of the tent. The hair along her spine was fully erected from the base of her skull to the root of her tail. She was making a sound I had never heard from her in 7 years. Not a bark, not a growl, a low, sustained, keen, continuous and slightly nasal, coming from somewhere deep in her chest. It had the quality of a sound that was happening to her rather than one she was choosing to make. I put my hand on her back and she was trembling so hard I could feel it through my palm. I have never felt this dog tremble, not even as a puppy, not even when injured. I put my hand on her and she was shaking the way something shakes when fear has completely overridden voluntary muscle control. I listened. First pass, nothing out of the ordinary. Breeze across the bald above, somewhere distant an owl. And then footsteps outside into the south of the tent, moving past it maybe 10 feet, heading uphill toward the high bald. Slow footsteps, unhurried, but heavy in a way that didn't match what I knew to be up there. Grass and thin soil over rock don't transmit weight the way deep forest floor does, and yet each of those footsteps compressed the ground audibly in something large, much larger than a person. I opened the tent a few inches and looked out. The bald above me was open and moonlit, and I could see clearly for several hundred yards. Moving across the open grass uphill, going away from me toward the ridge crest, was a figure, two-legged. But the way it moved was wrong in a specific way. The gait had the quality of a quadruped choosing to walk upright. The rolling hip motion and the weight distribution of an animal built for 4 legs, making a deliberate effort to use 2. It was very large in the shoulders and narrow below that, and the arms, though at distance I could not be certain, appeared to hang lower than human arms hang. Rogue would not bark. I want to emphasize this again because I know what it means. A dog that will face down a bear refused to bark at this thing. Whatever the calculation in her mind was, she had determined that barking was the wrong response. She pressed herself against my leg and kept that sustained keening sound, and she tracked the figure with her nose until it went over the ridgeline and was gone from both sight and smell. She was not herself for the rest of that day and into the next morning, close to me and quiet, and not interested in the trail the way she normally is. By the following day, she was back to normal, but in the first hours after, she behaved the way an animal behaves when it has been genuinely frightened rather than just startled. When I think about that night, the thing I keep coming back to is not the figure on the bald. It's the expression on my dog's face when I look down at her. What that looks like when a dog that will stand down a bear has decided it can't protect you from what's out there. Like this video if you're still thinking about it after the screen goes dark. It is genuinely one of the best things you can do to help this channel reach more people, and every like matters more than you might think. Story 9. I'm Cassidy, 28, currently finishing a PhD in environmental science at Virginia Tech. Fieldwork is a significant part of my life at this stage, which means I'm routinely in backcountry settings for work, sometimes alone, in all kinds of conditions. I've camped in every season and in terrain ranging from high alpine to lowland riparian. I'm not someone who finds the backcountry frightening in itself. It's a workspace for me, as much as anything else. I go in, I do my work, I come out. The dark, the isolation, the sounds of wildlife at night, none of that produces anxiety in me the way it might in someone less accustomed to it. I also want to say something about how I think, because it's relevant to what I'm about to describe. I'm a scientist. That means when I observe something anomalous, my first impulse is not to reach for an extraordinary explanation. It's to look for all the ordinary explanations first and test each one. I'm trained to do this and I do it automatically. What I observed during a solo field stay in the Jefferson National Forest in Virginia. Went through that process thoroughly and came out the other side without an ordinary explanation attached. That's not something I say lightly, and it's not something that I'm entirely comfortable with. This was a watershed survey, multi-day, remote location, my advisor and I the first 2 days, and then her departure left me alone for 3 more. Solo field work is normal in my discipline. I set up a base camp near the target watershed and did day loops from there. The work was good and the data collection was clean. 2 uneventful nights alone. Third night alone, around midnight, I woke up to a sound. I need to work at describing it because the description matters, and the obvious descriptors aren't quite right. It was a low tone, resonant, with a sustained quality, like a held musical note, rather than a percussive sound. It seemed to come from below, from the ground, or from the rock structure underneath the soil. This is not as strange as it sounds. I've been in karst terrain before, and I know that acoustic anomalies from underground voids are real and scientifically documented. The Appalachians have significant karst geology in places. So I noted it in my field book and went back to sleep. Fourth night. The sound again, same quality, slightly longer in duration. But this time something else. From my tent, I had a line of sight to the creek bank, which was in partial moonlight. As I lay listening to the tone, I looked at the water. The surface of the creek, which was a clear, shallow mountain stream running about 18 inches deep at center, was rippling in a pattern that moved upstream, against the current. I am familiar with surface water behavior under a wide variety of conditions, and I have no hydrological explanation for what I observed. A pattern moving opposite to current direction requires either a subsurface disturbance originating downstream or a surface wind from the upstream direction. There was no wind. The trees were still. I got up, took my field notebook and headlamp, and sat at the door of my tent to write observations. I want to be clear that what happened next was not preceded by any kind of fear response. I was not in a heightened state. I was being methodical. A figure came up out of the water. I'm writing that sentence and reading it back, and I understand how it sounds, but that is what I observed. It rose from the surface of the creek, from beneath it, in the center where the water was deepest, and stood upright in the stream. It was approximately the height of a tall person, but the proportions were elongated, the limbs longer than human limbs, in a ratio that I estimated at the time at roughly 1.3 to 1 compared to a 6-foot person. It was dark in a way that was not the darkness of clothing or shadow. It appeared to absorb the ambient light around it rather than reflect it. There was no definition of features that I could see at the distance of approximately 40 feet. It stood in the water for 4 minutes. I watched my watch. It did not appear to look at me or toward me. The hollow sound increased in volume and pitch, and then the figure moved, not by walking, but by translating laterally along the creek while remaining in the water, covering 30 or so feet. And then it descended back below the surface the way you'd lower yourself into something carefully. The water closed, the rippling stopped, the tone faded. I recorded all of this in my field notebook. Date, time, GPS coordinates, duration, observable characteristics. I wrote it as I would write any field observation. When I submitted my notes at the end of the project, I removed that section. I kept it separate. It's not in any government database. It's in my personal notes, and it's in this submission. I don't know what moved in that creek. I know what I observed, and I know my training, and I know that what I observed does not have an ordinary explanation. That's where I'm leaving it for now. Story 10. I want to start by saying that I considered not submitting this for a long time. I'm a private person by nature, and I don't have any social media presence, and sharing personal experience with a large anonymous audience is not something that comes naturally or comfortably to me. But I've been carrying this around for almost 4 years, and the people in my immediate life who know about it have reached the limit of how many times they can hear me describe it and still engage with it seriously. My brother thinks it was a dream. My friend Carl thinks it was acoustic phenomenon. Neither of them was there, and neither of them can explain the specific content of what the voice said. So here I am. My name is Theodore. I'm 54 years old and I work as a property appraiser in the western Pennsylvania area. I spend a fair amount of time outdoors on my own time, hiking mostly, and I had been planning a solo weekend in the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia for most of that summer. I was dealing with a difficult stretch professionally, and I needed a few days of quiet. 2 nights, a moderate loop trail, a backcountry permit for a site I'd scouted on the map. Nothing ambitious. I just needed the particular kind of quiet that only comes when there are no phones and no people. First night was everything I needed it to be. Good camp, good food, the forest entirely quiet after 10 p.m., a sky with no light pollution that I spent an embarrassingly long time lying on my back in the meadow looking at before I went to bed. Slept well. Second day I hiked most of the loop, had lunch at a waterfall, got back to camp in the late afternoon, ate, did my cleanup, and was in my sleeping bag by 9:30. Second night is what I'm here to talk about. I woke in the dark with the completeness that sometimes happens when the ambient sound changes. Nothing alarming, just awake. Totally dark inside the tent, overcast blocking the moon, silent except for a very faint breeze in the canopy. I lay there taking stock, the way I'd gotten in the habit of doing, just listening for 30 or 40 seconds before moving. Everything was ordinary. I was beginning to settle back under when I heard my name. Theodore. Just like that. A woman's voice. Coming from the trees to the east of camp, maybe 30 yards out. Clear and present, with no ambiguity whatsoever. She said my name the way you say someone's name when you want their attention and you know them. Not calling from a distance, addressing me. My first thought was another camper, a woman who for some reason knew my name, or had heard it somehow, or had confused me with someone else. My second thought was that this made no logical sense at any level. The third thought, which arrived with physical force, was that the voice wasn't right, not in its content, in its acoustic properties. And I want to try to describe this precisely because it is the thing I keep coming back to. The voice had no reverb, none. Sound outdoors always has environmental interaction. It bounces off tree trunks, it gets absorbed by foliage. It picks up the acoustic signature of the space it's moving through. This voice had none of that. It was completely dry, completely flat, the way a voice sounds in a recording booth with acoustic treatment on the walls. Except we were in an open forest. The intonation was correct. The word was my name, correctly spoken. But the space it occupied was wrong. It was as if the sound was being generated in a place that had no acoustic environment at all. It said my name 5 more times over the course of perhaps 12 minutes. Each utterance was identical, precisely identical, the same intonation, the same duration, the same flat acoustics. The same way pressing play on the same audio clip produces the same output every time. Between each utterance, there was complete silence. After the 6th, there was nothing more. I lay awake until full daylight and then packed and hiked out. I've been back to the Monongahela twice since, different locations, different seasons, nothing unusual. I don't go back to that specific hollow. I've also stopped introducing myself by my full name when I'm alone outdoors. That's a strange habit to have developed, and I'm aware of how it sounds. But something in me decided that whatever was in those trees that night knew my name because it had heard it, and I would rather not give it the opportunity to hear it again. Ring that notification bell right now if you haven't already. YouTube buries new uploads without your engagement, and I don't want you to miss a single story. Your bell ring literally keeps this channel alive. Story 11. I go by Rufus. I'm 26 years old. I moved from Atlanta to Boone, North Carolina about 2 years ago to pursue landscape and wilderness photography seriously after leaving a corporate job that was making me into someone I didn't want to be. I drive out before dawn to locations I've scouted, hike in with my gear, and spend the day working. I'm alone most of the time because the kind of stillness that produces the images I'm after doesn't coexist with conversation. I've been doing this long enough that solitude in wild places is my baseline, not an exception. The mountains around Boone don't frighten me, or they didn't before last November. There's a burn area in the mountains not far from where I live, a significant section of forest that went through either a wildfire or a prescribed burn several years back, and is now in mid-succession recovery. Standing dead timber, new growth pushing through the ash soil, the dramatic textural contrast between the gray snags and the pale new vegetation. Photographically, it's extraordinary. The light in a burn at dawn has a quality that doesn't exist anywhere else. I've shot there perhaps 15 times since I found it. It's one of my best locations, and some of my strongest images have come from there. Last November, I was in before 5 to catch the early light, parked on a logging road, hiked about a mile through undamaged forest to the burn margin, arrived at the edge of the burned area just as the sky began to lighten in the east. I've done this enough times that I have a route through the burn that I follow to work the best angles as the light changes, moving through the standing dead timber in a loose grid. About an hour in, I came around a cluster of large burned snags and stopped. In the center of a large open area of ash soil, maybe 200 feet ahead of me, was something I had not photographed before and had not seen in my dozen previous visits to this location. It was a figure, very tall, standing upright with its back to me, standing in the open ash, perfectly still, facing away into the deeper burn. My first read was wildlife. A bear would be the obvious guess, but the posture was wrong immediately for a bear. Bears don't stand that still that long on two legs, and they don't hold their arms the way this thing's arms were held, slightly away from the body and angled downward, elbows slightly bent, as if the hands at the ends of those arms were something that needed to be kept from touching the body. I had my camera up. I was already shooting because I had been shooting everything in that burn all morning, and my hand went to the shutter by muscle memory, 200mm zoom, which gave me a significant look at what I was looking at through the viewfinder. And what I was looking at was not a bear. The surface of the thing, what would be the skin if it was a living creature, had a texture that my image files later resolved clearly enough to study. It had the character of charred wood, not dark skin, not fur, not bark. The specific texture of wood that has been burned, the cracked and carbonized surface, the depth of the grain, the particular matte flatness of charred organic material. It covered the figure uniformly from what I could see, the arms and shoulders and the back of the head. As I was shooting, its head rotated. I need to be specific about this word. Not turned, rotated, in the way an owl's head rotates. That full sweep well past the natural range of a neck, built for forward-facing vision, past 90 degrees, continuing past 120, until the face, if it had a face, was aimed directly at the lens of my camera from 200 feet. I lowered the camera. In my years of photography, I have not once let a shot determine whether I'm safe. I have photographed bears at closer distance than this without lowering my camera. But something about the direct regard of that thing, across 200 feet through the viewfinder, communicated something that bypassed every professional habit I had. I moved backward through the burn for roughly 50 yards, then turned and walked out at a measured pace. I did not run. Some part of me had decided that running was the wrong choice, and I trusted that part. When I got to the trailhead, I drove home without stopping. The fourth frame, which I shot as the head was already rotating, shows the figure clearly in the center of the open ash. I have looked at the texture on that figure in those image files at full resolution many times. I've shown the image to 2 other professional photographers and an academic who studies unusual photography. None of us have a classification for what that surface is, what that texture represents. I've never posted that image. I'm not sure I ever will. Some images feel like a door, and I'm not sure opening it further is something I want to do. Story 12. My name is Deb. I'm an ER nurse in Kingsport, Tennessee, and I've been driving a specific 18-mile stretch of 2-lane road through the Cherokee National Forest for about 12 years as part of a commute to a part-time clinic job on the other side of the mountain. I know every mile of that road in every season and every weather condition. I know where the pavement breaks and heaves in winter. I know the deer crossings, I know the mile markers. I know the one pull-off with the view where I used to stop and eat my lunch before my schedule got too tight for that. I know that road the way you know any piece of ground you have traveled 10,000 times. So when I tell you what I saw on it in December 2 winters ago, I'm not telling you a story about being unfamiliar with the territory. I'm telling you about something that happened on ground I know as well as my own driveway. It was after midnight, which is not unusual for that commute. The clinic hours run late on certain days, and the drive home in the small hours through the forest is something I've done probably 200 times. Cold, clear December night, frost on the road surface. So I was driving deliberately, maybe 35 through the mountain sections. No other vehicles in either direction. My headlights the only light for as far as I could see. About 6 miles into the forest section, I picked up something on my right shoulder in the headlights. An animal large on the gravel margin, moving. My first read was deer, which is automatic on that road, and then my brain corrected almost immediately. The movement was wrong. The body was too tall for a deer, and the gait was not a deer's gait. The front and hind pairs of limbs were moving in a cadence that was off from the diagonal sequence a deer uses, more synchronized, more deliberate, like something that had learned to move on 4 legs as a second language. As I got closer, my headlights illuminated it fully, and it turned to face the oncoming lights. And I saw its face. What I saw was a human face. Not human-like, not a resemblance. A human face with dark hair and dark eyes on a body moving on all 4s on the gravel shoulder of a mountain road at 12:15 at night. The face of a young woman. Eyes that caught my headlights and reflected them the flat way animal eyes do in the tapetum. Not the way human eyes do, but a human face. I did not stop. That decision happened without deliberation, somewhere below the level of conscious choice. My foot stayed on the gas, and my hand stayed on the wheel, and I drove past. In my rearview mirror, shrinking in the red wash of my taillights, I watched the thing rise from 4 legs to 2. One fluid upward motion, standing, and then looking after me as I drove away. I pulled over 2 miles down the road. I was shaking hard enough that pulling over was a safety decision. I sat in my car with the hazard lights on and my hands flat on my thighs for about 20 minutes, just breathing. I have been an ER nurse for 19 years. I have seen trauma that most people won't see in a lifetime, and I have stayed functional through all of it. I'm not telling you I pulled over to cry. I'm telling you that my hands were shaking badly enough that driving was not safe. When I got home, I told my husband something had been in the road, probably a deer, and I'd been startled. I couldn't say the real thing out loud at 12:30 in the morning in my own kitchen. I lay awake for hours, and when I slept, I dreamed about the face and the eyes. I've since had several conversations with people who are native to that region, families who have been in those hollows for generations, and I've heard about things that live in those mountains that the old families know about and that newer residents generally don't. The word skinwalker comes from Navajo tradition specifically, and I don't want to be careless with it. But I've been told there are names in the mountain tradition of that region for what I saw, and that the road through the forest has never been considered entirely safe by people who know it well, particularly at night, particularly alone. I rearranged my clinic schedule, so I'm not driving that stretch after dark anymore. I told the clinic director it was a personal preference, which is entirely true. Whatever that thing was on that road, I don't want to see it again. And I don't want it seeing me again either. If you have a story and you've been sitting on it because you're not sure anyone will believe you, I promise you, I will. Email is in the description below. Every single submission gets read, and the best ones end up here. Story 13. My name is Soren, 37 years old. I spent 6 years doing habitat restoration field work in the southern Appalachians before promotion moved me into an office role. And over those 6 years, I accumulated more nights in the backcountry than most people do in a lifetime of recreational camping. I've slept in places that weren't on maps, in weather that wasn't camping weather, in terrain that other people would have called impassable. I've been genuinely alone in the deep backcountry, in ways that would be difficult to explain to someone who hasn't experienced it. Total isolation, days from any road, in the company of nothing but the forest and whatever the forest contained. I'm saying this not to establish some kind of credential, but to give you a frame for what I'm about to describe, because the only way it makes its full weight felt is if you understand that I am not a person who invents things in the dark. I've been in the dark too many times for it to have any mystique left. I know what sounds are normal and what sounds are not. I know the difference between unease produced by an unfamiliar environment and unease produced by something actually being wrong. What happened to me on the 6th night of what I called my final solo trip is in the second category. And I've spent a year trying to think my way clear of it, and I can't. The trip was my goodbye to the work I'd been doing for a decade. A long solo, 7 nights, a remote route in the southern Smokies where the terrain is genuine wilderness, and you can go days without any human trace. I'd done the logistics carefully, the permits and the resupply and the navigation planning, and I was in good physical shape and well equipped. The first 5 nights were as good as it gets out there. Wildlife encounters, hard miles, the physical satisfaction of sustained effort in beautiful wild country. I was sleeping well and thinking clearly and feeling genuinely that the decision to do this trip as a bookend was the right one. 6th night. I camped at a site I'd used twice before over the years, in a small clearing near the head of a creek drainage. Good shelter, surrounded on 3 sides by the ridge, and a stand of old hemlock, established fire ring. I knew this spot and liked it. Set up in the last of the evening light, cooked a good meal, wrote in my journal, listened to the sounds of the drainage settling into night. I woke up in the deep hours to silence. Not night quiet. The active quality of silence I described in the work notes as biotic suppression, which is the formal term for what happens when a wide range of species in an area simultaneously reduce their acoustic output in response to the presence of a significant predator. I've documented this phenomenon in fieldwork. I know it when I'm in it. Every living thing in that drainage had gone quiet at once, and the quality of the silence was the held breath quality of a prey response. I lay still in catalog. Tent sealed, sleeping bag, no temperature distress, no obvious physical cause for waking. And then I became aware that there was something at the south edge of the clearing, not moving, not making any sound, present in the way that large things are present in small spaces, by what they do to the peripheral quality of the darkness around them. I'm a scientist, or was, and I tried to be systematic. I lay still and gathered information. What I could determine from inside the tent was directional, south edge of the clearing, approximately at the hemlock margin, large on the evidence of the peripheral darkness disturbance, not moving. It was present, unmoving, for between 1 and 2 hours. My sense of time in that state is imprecise, but my watch confirmed the duration after. In that whole time it made no sound and made no movement. It simply was there at the edge of the clearing, in the dark, for 1 to 2 hours, and waiting is the word. Whatever it was doing, it had the quality of waiting. Not stalking, not circling, not testing. Waiting with a patience that implied something about the nature of time that I couldn't follow all the way to the end. Around 3 in the morning, it began to make a sound. I want to be precise in a way that I know will be frustrating. It was not a sound I have any category for. I have good categories. I have spent years in the field. I know what the full range of Appalachian wildlife sounds like. I know what voices carry from distant ridge to ridge in mountain terrain. This was not a sound in any of my categories. It had the architecture of speech, by which I mean it had the structural elements, the start-stops, the rising and falling patterns, the rhythmic groupings that are the skeleton of language. but the phonetics that filled that architecture were not from any human language system I've encountered or studied. It sounded like something that had observed language extensively and was reconstructing it from the outside. This continued for approximately 15 minutes. Then it stopped. And then, in the silence that followed, in a voice that was completely unlike what had preceded it, in clear and unambiguous American English with no accent and no observable affect, it said a single sentence. One sentence. And I am not going to repeat that sentence here. I've thought about whether to include it in this submission, and each time I come back to the same decision, which is no. I will tell you only that the sentence it said was a sentence that could only have been meaningful to me specifically. That it referenced something from my personal history that I have never told another person, and have no reason to have ever told another person. And that sits in a category of private memory that I have no mechanism to explain its presence in whatever that thing's knowledge base was. It did not say anything else. The dawn came in the way it always does. I packed and left at first light, moving steadily, and made the trailhead well ahead of my original schedule. I've thought about it from every angle I have. The obvious candidate explanations fail on the specificity of the content. You can hallucinate a voice in conditions of sleep deprivation or extreme stress, but you cannot hallucinate content that is accurate and specific, and that your conscious mind has no access to reconstruct. You can argue that the information exists somewhere in my memory and was externalized in some anomalous state. Maybe. But the sentence I heard did not feel like something coming from inside me. It felt like something being read to me. Like someone had access to a file I didn't know existed and had decided to show me they had it. That was my last camp. I meant it as a ceremonial goodbye to a chapter of my life. It became something else instead. I don't go back into the backcountry now, not for any single definitive reason. Just that whatever was at the edge of that clearing on the 6th night had been watching me, or someone like me, long enough to know something I'd never said out loud. And I no longer feel comfortable with the idea of being watched by something I cannot see. The mountains are old and they remember things we don't. I don't think I need to offer myself up to that memory again. That's all 13 stories, friends. 13 accounts from 13 different people with 13 different lives. Submitted to me because they didn't know where else to put what had happened to them. I believe all of them. Not because I'm credulous, not because I prefer the scary explanation to the mundane one. I believe them because I've read enough of these to recognize the texture of truth, the specific involuntary detail that a person wouldn't think to invent, the admission of fear from someone who doesn't want to admit it, the flatness of the voice when someone has moved through the dramatic part and is in the place beyond drama where they're just trying to make sense of something. And think about these mountains a lot, about what they've seen and what they hold. These ridges are among the oldest geological formations on the planet, worn down from what were once peaks that rivaled anything standing today. And whatever has been living in those hollows has had a corresponding amount of time to become what it is. We walk in with our permits and our trail apps and our freeze-dried food and our 10-day weather forecasts, and we think we've accounted for everything. We haven't. The people in these stories thought the same thing. Stay safe out there. If you go into those mountains, go with respect for what you don't know. And if something happens to you out there, something that doesn't have an ordinary explanation, something that you've been carrying around and couldn't figure out where to put, you know where I am. The email is in the description below. I read every single submission. I am always listening. Subscribe to Park Ranger Files if you haven't yet. New episodes every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern. Hit that bell so you never miss one. If you have a story of your own, email it to us using the address in the description below. Tell us what happened. We want to hear it. Your experience matters, and it deserves to be heard. Like this video, leave a comment below, telling me which of tonight's 13 stories is going to keep you up, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Every like, comment, and share helps this community grow and keeps these stories reaching the people who need them.